All right, I think most people are in, Hector, if you want to get started.
Right, sure. Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to this panel called Lessons in Conflict Sensitivity Conservation. My name is Hector Morales Muñoz. I am a doctoral research fellow at the Alliance of Biodiversity International, CIED, and the Leibniz Center for Agricultural Landscape Research. And it is my great pleasure to moderate this event today. Should be a really interesting discussion. This event is simultaneously translated into Spanish and French. So if you would like to access the translation, click on the globe button at the bottom of your screen and select the language, either French or Spanish. I will say this in Spanish. Este evento va a ser traducido simultáneamente al español. Solo tiene que darle clic al globo terráqueo en la parte inferior de la pantalla y seleccionar el idioma que lo quieren traducir. Yeah, all right. So, Maria, could you please show the screen? So we have we look forward to have a conference that is characterized by mutual respect and collaboration. So as a reminder, we required for the conference that you read this anti-discrimination, harassment, and retaliation policy, and of course to comply with the rules of respect and no discrimination also at this panel. All right, so just to mention a few how the agenda will go is we are going to talk for 5 minutes with the help of this tool called Menti to do an introduction about the interaction between conservation and conflict sensitivity. And then we will discuss the issues around conflict sensitivity and the lessons learned about conflict sensitivity and conservation. So with a really excellent panelists that we have today, which are 4 of them. So I just want to mention that over 80% of war-related conflicts occur in biodiversity hotspots. So to ensure successful and sustainable outcomes of conservation, organizations must account for these ever-changing and sometimes insecure conditions. So we're going to focus in this panel on the importance of integrating conflict sensitivity measures into environmental conservation efforts, and also to talk about the possible tensions that exist between nature conservation and the interests of communities that sometimes see these efforts as foreign efforts or colonialist efforts, even though this is changing, and also the tensions that exist between livelihoods, economic development, and conservation, among others. So yeah, we have an excellent panel, and we're going to start with the Menti right now to see what the audience is about. So please, you can see also in the chat the website for Menti to access Menti, and then just put this code, and we will see the questions with regards to conflict sensitivity conservation. Afterwards, I will introduce each of the panelists. Okay, so we have the first question. So we would like to know what 2 or 3 words come to mind when you think of conflict sensitive conservation. And you can start writing it now. Great. Okay, the difficult turn from red to yellow. So I think it would be interesting if that happens also in reality. Okay, many interesting words. Power structure. Not environmental peace building. Awareness of power dynamics. Stakeholders. colonial legacies. Colombia. There might be some Colombians in the audience, maybe. Access, responsibility, stakeholders, resilience, continuity of struggles. Okay, I think this might be super interesting for our panelists to see. Participation, stakeholders, local political orders. Great, super interesting. Okay, see that power structure is prominent. Someone agrees with this word, power structure. Okay, great. So I think we can continue to the next question. And it has to do with where are you joining us from? Okay, we have people from the US, Germany, America, but this is South America, Central America, North America. Right, Bogota, Italy, Sweden, Portugal, Seattle, Switzerland, Canada, Netherlands, Colorado, Portugal, great. Okay, awesome. Great, so a real global audience. Okay, I think we can continue with the third question. And it is, what would you like to learn about conflict sensitivity conservation during this session? Right? So maybe some practitioner interested in practical experience, other approaches, everything. Great. I don't know if we can cover everything, but that would be interesting. How to convince staff across a huge conservation organization why this is important. Okay, that I think there's a chance to make that. Best practices from the field, new methods, mainstreaming conflict sensitivity in conservation NGOs, how to operationalize it, where are the best opportunities for engagement, practical advice, inclusion of cultural and economic concerns. Okay, all of them are really relevant. I think that is great. Protection of social leaders, one of the main issues in conflict-affected biodiversity hotspots. Key questions to ask when designing programs. Okay, great. Okay, with this great introduction of the interest of our participants, we will start with the presentation from Sheila Schalke. So we are going to have a 12-minute talk, each participant, and follow up by one question to follow up on the discussion, and then 30 minutes of discussion with all the audience and questions, all right? So Sheila Schalke is a research associate at the Environmental Law Institute and an Environmental Peacebuilding coordinator for the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. Her current research focuses on the monitoring and evaluation of environmental peacebuilding, conflict sensitivity, and the green resource curves. And she's going to talk us about a research study that she conducted from the JEF activities and programs, right? So Sheila, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's actually going to be, one more tab down.
Mhm.
There we go. All right. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Hector. So as Hector mentioned, I'm going to be providing some context on how conflict and fragility can impact environmental conservation projects. And to do this, we're going to talk about some findings from a 2020 evaluation conducted by the Environmental Law Institute and the Global Environment Facilities Independent Evaluation Office on global environment facility support to fragile and conflict-affected situations. Next slide. So to begin, I'd like to just give a quick introduction to the Global Environment Facility. You'll hear me abbreviate that as the GEF. So the GEF was established ahead of the 1992 Rio Earth Summit to help finance environmental protection in the Global South. As of 2021, they had supported over 5,000 projects in 170 countries on a variety of issues, including biodiversity, oceans, forest conservation, climate change, and other such topics. The GEF is actually the largest funder of projects focused on global environmental challenges, and they provided more than 21.1 billion in grants and an additional 114 billion in co-financing. Next slide, please. So to speak a little bit more in specificity about our particular research. So the Environmental Law Institute partnered with the GEF Independent Evaluation Office to investigate how conflict and fragility have impacted its projects. The evaluation examined 4,136 different projects, which was the organization's full portfolio at the time. It used a number of different methods, which you can see on the slide there, including document analysis, statistical analysis, remote sensing, interviews, and then as well as case studies from seven specific conflict-affected and fragile situations. Next slide. So embarking on this evaluation, one of the first things that really stood out to us was that we noticed just how many of the projects in the portfolio were considered to be conflict affected. It seems that the vast majority of just projects actually do occur in conflict affected or fragile environments. 88% of all GEF country level projects occurred in fragile situations. And in terms of investment, $4 billion has been invested in countries affected by major armed conflict. You can actually see on the map there highlighting all of the kind of different countries that projects have taken place in that on the sliding scale of how conflict affected they are. All right, next slide. And so looking at so many projects and with such a large data set actually gave us the opportunity to conduct a pretty extensive quantitative analysis to compare these conflict affected or fragile situations to projects undertaken in what we would say are stable environments or countries that are lacking these kinds of conflict dynamics. And we found quite a number of really interesting and important findings. So the first one I'd like to emphasize is that a country's fragility status has a statistically significant negative impact on all of the GEF's terminal evaluation review performance indicators. So that's to say that conflict and fragility can impact a project's execution quality, implementation quality, monitoring and evaluation implementation, monitoring and evaluation design, sustainability, and outcomes. If you actually take a look at the graph on your screen here, you can see the difference in the average scores on these different categories for different projects. So the red line shows the average scores for countries considered on alert. So those are countries that are experiencing active armed conflict at the time. Projects in the warning category, so those are the more fragile situations, places that are kind of experiencing some level of conflict, maybe not to a particularly elevated status. And then you can compare those with the blue lines, which is just countries that are in a stable situation. And you can see there's a pretty linear effect for the most part on most of these categories in terms of how deeply they are affected by the conflict status. And so in addition to those findings, we've also found that conflict and fragility had a statistically significant impact on the likelihood of a project being dropped or canceled. And even where projects weren't dropped or canceled, they tended to see increased delays in completion for those happening in conflict affected situations. Next slide. And so our evaluation provided us a lot of insight, not only to the numbers, but we did do a pretty extensive overview of the project documents for each of these different cases. And as looking at these, we've created a typology here that categorizes the different ways in which we've seen conflict and fragility impact GEF projects. Generally impacts can be categorized by being caused by physical insecurity, social conflict and mistrust, complex economic situations, political fragility and weak governance, and coping strategies that are undertaken by local actors. Now, for the sake of time, I can't go into too much detail with this chart, but I do highly encourage everyone. I'll put a chat link to the full report so you can take a look at it in more detail. But one thing I would like to emphasize is just that the main takeaway here is that the larger operating environment conditions tend to trickle down into project operations. And that can affect the relevance, the effectiveness, the efficiency, and the sustainability of different projects. For example, you can see that a lot of times, a lot of the projects we looked at, the projects were dropped or canceled because of that first category there, physical insecurity, right? So project sites became inaccessible due to physical insecurity or concerns about the safety of the project staff and had to be dropped for that reason. To talk about one project in particular that I think emphasizes a lot of these different factors at play at once, we took a look at one GEF project focused on Lake Tanganyika, which is shared by Tanzania, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, and Zambia. And this project was quite severely impacted by changing political conditions in Burundi and DRC in the late 1990s. So the project had to decrease their planned fishing activities. It was a lake conservation project and livelihoods project. And because there was a growing concern amongst the local military that rebels were using fishing boats to transport raiding parties. And so the act of putting a fishing boat on the water, so for example, for the project team to do so as part of their project activities or for their monitoring and evaluation, actually presented a really severe security risk to the project staff. And so they had to entirely nix activities that put boats on the water, which was a lot of their work. And so they were able to work through that, but they had to completely change their project design on the fly because of that. So you can see how political fragility, weak governance, the coping strategies of other actors in the situation, and physical insecurity all combine there to create those conditions. Let's hit the next slide. And so though the just projects are impacted by conflict in all of these different ways, at the time of the evaluation at least, the institution did not have any standardized policies, safeguards, official guidance in place for the implementing staff operating in these areas. That said, implementing staff tended to be pretty innovative in terms of creating their own solutions to these problems and have continued to find ways to adapt their operations to the specific needs of their working context. Next slide. So in looking at the different ways that project staff have managed these issues, we've created another typology here that you can see that categorizes the different management strategies associated with GEF projects. Again, I can't walk through this in too much detail, but there's a few things I would like to highlight. So first, as you can see here, the acknowledgement box kind of spreads out over the top of all of these different mitigation strategies. And so what that signifies here is that anytime a project was responding to conflict dynamics, it has to start with some acknowledgement that there is conflict happening in the operating environment. People can't just kind of focus on the conservation and forget about the context that they're operating in. So while some projects kind of ended their interaction with conflict dynamics at just acknowledgement, we definitely found that the more successful projects were those that went beyond acknowledgement and took a more proactive approach. So to talk a little bit about the primary strategies we saw, the first was avoidance. So avoidance refers to doing that conflict analysis early on, trying to pinpoint areas that would be particularly dangerous to project staff, and then planning activities to avoid those areas. Next step up, and these are kind of in a growing level of proactivity, was mitigation. So trying to plan around how you would anticipate your project will interact with conflict dynamics. For example, training your project staff so that they're familiar with what's happening, creating an early warning system, taking a participatory approach, and being more active in the community. And the next set of risk management strategies we saw fell in the peace building category. So this refers actually to environmental conservation organizations that, noting the conflict dynamics that they were operating within, chose to actually use it as an opportunity to incorporate peace building elements into their work and kind of take a proactive stance towards building peace in the area. And then lastly is learning, which is its own category in many ways, but also plays well with the other categories in this chart here, which is when you are embarking on conflict-sensitive conservation, taking the time to not only build opportunities to learn into your project, but also taking the time to look at past projects that have been done in this area by other organizations and trying to incorporate their learning into your work as well. Next slide. So I want to just highlight a few of the strategic takeaways from our evaluation. First, it's really important to take the time to become familiar with the local conflict dynamics. It's really the only way to prepare. The only way to prepare is to adapt is to know what's happening around you. And so you should really go in with a plan to, stay abreast of the changing dynamics around you, because they are in these conflict situations and fragile situations, things can change really quickly, and you want to be plugged into that scene as much as possible. We also highly recommend creating meaningful, trusting relationships with local partners and also respecting their expertise of the environment. This is important for so many reasons, and it's hard to really quantify those, but in a very specific way to conflict sensitivity, they are the ones who have the best sense of what's happening on the ground. And if you can plug into their networks and better understand that, that's going to be helpful for you throughout your project, not only in designing it, but as you implement as well. We also emphasize planning for volatility and creating contingency measures. You can't anticipate unexpected happenings, but you can anticipate volatility and try to create ways for your project to be able to stay resilient to those changing dynamics. And then lastly, on the same vein, remain flexible and seek creative solutions. Can we go back to the last one? Yeah, thank you. One more. There we go. But yeah, it's very important to build flexibility into your project. So that's not just a mindset that you're taking up, but building it into the infrastructure of your project. For example, in your budgeting, putting aside money for contingency plans, or putting in a $0 budget line, so that if things change, you can move your funds around a little bit more easily, or working with your funder to figure out what other terms of flexibility might look like. Next slide. And so to finish up for today, I'd just like to re-emphasize a few key points for you all. First, conflict and fragility matter to how we design and carry out our work. Operating in these contexts present very unique risks, but also a lot of unique opportunities. And these contexts need to be approached differently than average project in a non-conflict setting. So project staff should assess risks early in the design phase and plan for potential complications early on. And likewise, institutions, knowing that they're going to be operating in conflict-affected situations, should try to be proactive in providing guidance to their implementers, changing their policies and safeguards, and training their staff to support these efforts. And to take a look at anything I've mentioned in more detail, including those wonderful graphics, we will put a link to the full evaluation, which is about 200 pages of very detailed information in the chat for you all. And so thank you so much for your time today.
Great, Sheila. Thank you very, very much for this interesting, insightful presentation. Also great time management. I really liked how you highlighted the importance of recognizing local knowledge and going in depth in the conflict dynamics. And I would also like to know, based on your research, what would be a key message to tell GEV regarding measuring projects' contribution to diminishing risks and fragility within an environmental project? If not only just preventing risks, but also doing good or getting more into this peace building side.
Yeah, I'm so happy you asked, Hector. I think it's a really interesting question, not only for the GEF, but for a lot of different organizations that are doing environmental work that maybe don't have that peace building mandate as well. So I think that in a cultural level, organizations and institutions need to take a mindset shift to realize that they're operating in a larger system and to figure out how to listen to their practitioners and to communities they work with to incorporate more of that peace building element. So as we saw in our research, a lot of different projects that we looked at, recognizing that they were operating in these kinds of environments, took the time to not only avoid or mitigate issues, but as you said, to actively build peace. And they worked with their oversight to create opportunities to do that and adjusting their activities to do that. So I think that one thing that institutions can do is when they receive proposals that they are familiar with in areas that they know are experiencing different kinds of conflict or different kinds of fragility, is reaching out to the proponent to figure out how they might incorporate not just conflict sensitivity, but active peace building in those efforts. And I think that that would be a big step in terms of changing the way we do the work, and also for those organizations to take more data on this kind of work as well.
Indeed. Great. Okay. So now moving into practical experience, our next panelist is Janet Edmond. She is the Senior Director of Peace and Development Partnerships at Conservation International, and she leads Environmental Peacebuilding program integrating conflict analysis and sensitivity into forest, freshwater, and ocean programs across the globe. She has a master's in public health from Tulane University School for Public Health and Tropical Medicine, and a bachelor's in international relations from Boston University. So thank you very much, Janet, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Hector and Sheila, and to all the panelists. I'm so excited to be here today. And thank you to our tech support. We would be lost without you, of course, and our translators. I want to offer you some lessons in conflict sensitivity related to conservation. And I think this morning, our opening plenary, the speakers really, highlighted the need for all of us to learn from each other and to share these lessons. And so hopefully by the end, you'll have some practical tips, which I heard in the Mentimeter, and then we can also unpack a bit more of, what is it that we really can do to shift that mindset that Sheila just talked about. So maybe go on to the next slide, please. And I hope most of you know about Conservation International. We are one of the big international conservation of biodiversity organizations, founded in 1987. We work in about 35 countries around the world, and we have tended to work in those places where biodiversity was most under threat and endemic. Many of you will know about biodiversity hotspots probably. Our priorities have kind of evolved over the years, where we don't necessarily right now just work in protected areas. We work more at the landscape level, and we can talk more about that. But just to say that CI has always had its mission to be about biodiversity conservation and human well-being. This people need nature to thrive is one of our big taglines. And those connections are critical, obviously, for sustainable development. So moving on to the next slide. Borrowing this photo from one of our colleagues in Kruger, just would love to explain a little bit more about CI's path to conflict-sensitive conservation. This really started about 2013. There were a couple of donors and interests and things that were kind of bubbling up in CI, and we said we should probably take a closer look at the role of conflict in our conservation natural resource management programs. And we were very thankful to have our colleagues at the International Institute for Sustainable Development come in and kind of look under the hood and see, what was CI doing? Did people recognize the role of conflict? And of course, the answer was yes, but we weren't necessarily saying conflict. We weren't necessarily talking about it, but a lot of the programs that we were doing at the community level, involving stakeholders, planning around protected areas, capacity building, was very much in the line of environmental peace building, leading toward that. So what we did was take quite a big exploratory awareness raising campaign. And I just want to shout out to Peace Nexus Foundation, which was one of our first donors to really help us look at this set of issues. I think, Catriona this morning talked about the different ways that environmental groups can look at peace building, and I think we've pretty much tried all of them. So there's a lot to say there. And then just before we move on to the next slide, just to say that conservation has changed a bit. I've been at CI now 18 years, and we've really seen this move away from, protected areas and keeping people out to working more at the landscape level and looking at how nature and species relate to the larger production systems in those landscapes. So moving on to the next slide. I think it's animated, so you might want to just click through it. So obviously, like I said, we have seen conflict in a lot of the conservation work that we've done. We work a lot with private sector partners to look at their practices. Mining is a huge issue in many of the places where we work, both large scale and small scale. Land tenure, land rights. These are all really, really big challenges. And then of course, deforestation, right, which is one of the biggest. So we see it play out, not just in the terrestrial, but also in the ocean and marine protected areas, illegal fishing, that kind of thing. So, this is really maybe fundamental. But when we started this work, we really had to talk about conflict and what it is. And you can go on to the next slide. We spent some time, trying to define it. What's the best definition? And this very simple definition, which is just, when two or more parties have or think that they have incompatible objectives. This sits okay with most people. They need to internalize it a little bit, right? Like, this is as simple as, you and your partner, child, whoever not, wanting to go to a different restaurant at night, and how do you negotiate that conflict? It can be very simple, or it can be the bigger conflicts, right, over access to mineral rights and land use. So having to get this into people's minds and have them accept it is a little bit tough, because they want conflict to be violent. It has to be violent, and it's not. It's just, in our daily lives, we see it all the time. And you can go on to the next slide. So I think it's like at the personal level, people really need to think and reflect on it and recognize that it is part of life. Like, a lot of people will be like, oh, I avoid conflict, I don't want to deal with conflict, but that's not part of life. So being able to address and then identify where the conflict is coming is really, on the path to hopeful some success. So if you can go on to the next slide. And I saw that Hesta had a thank you in the chat, and she knows, I think I told her that I stole this from Peace Nexus. They came in, and when we kicked off our partnership a couple years ago, walked us through a really, really informative exercise, like looking internally at processes and everything. What are some of the good things that we have in our favor, and what are some of the negatives? And when you go on to the next slide, you'll see I just put a couple of them. There's so much more to talk about. And a lot of this will, obviously be the same as some of the other participants, but context matters. We need to know where we're working, what all the dynamics are, local voices. There's a lot of tools out there, so really being able to help people address them. And then partnerships are critical. Like, when we started this work, one of our biggest partners was Catholic Relief Service in the water sector, and they came in and taught us a lot about peace building. And we've had many, many partners help us along the way. And then if you go into the next slide, to talk about Pebbles, again, that, evidence, the call for evidence. We're a science-based organization, so people are always like, give me the proof, where's the proof? So that call for better evidence is certainly one we hear. Being able to build those champions is key, and sometimes, we need to have dedicated resources for that, which is not necessarily across the donor community. And then, staff safety, right? I mean, those situations that sometimes staff are under, like in Colombia and in other areas of violent conflict, we have to be, really attentive to capacitating them to recognize the areas of conflict, to understand, do no harm, and to really be also looking out for them. So, and we can talk more about that And then I think the next slide, that's just a quote. This is from one of our conflict professionals who basically said, you can animate it, I think, without peace, there's no conservation. And then, on the flip side, without conservation, there is no peace. So that's the end. And I see Hector's come on. So hopefully I did okay on my time. And definitely looking forward to more discussion. And this is just the definition of conflict sensitivity. I threw this in there. I noticed somebody in the Mentimeter said that conflict sensitivity and environmental peace building are not the same. So I don't know if we'll get into that a little bit more, but I would definitely say that they are. So over to you.
Thank you, Janet. You were super effective with your time and also giving tons of lessons learned and information. I really liked that you emphasized this change from protected areas merely to landscape level interventions. And also, I really like that. I come from more from the peace building side, so I really like that you recall on that conflict is not per se something negative, but it's also part of life, and it can also help to move situations forward. I think this is a great thing to say. The partnerships at the local level, and also the call for improved evidence and monitoring and evaluation. And yeah, there's going to be a panel about the monitoring and evaluation on Friday, so reach to it in the agenda. Great. So I would like to ask you, I'm curious more about, since you mentioned your work in Colombia, etc., but also on a global scale, there has been a wave of shrinking democratic spaces for the last couple of years. So can you explain the approach that Conservation International plays to enable dialogue spaces for multi-stakeholder dialogue between communities, government, the private sector, etc.?
Sure. That's a really complicated, long question, but I can give you like Reader's Digest, right? Real short answer. In that I think CI has learned a lot of lessons over the years about how to identify and address risks. So we kind of have an overarching safety and security protocol, which of course in COVID times, right, has become very, very important. But also we are looking like where we are in different countries, what are the levels of risks that we are under and our staff are under. So we try to prioritize, protocols and processes so that there are safety concerns put in there. Also dialogue spaces, we do a lot of bringing people together. Obviously we can't do that in COVID, but we try to make sure that we're being very mindful of do no harm and really working with local conditions and local people to put in place the processes that will hopefully protect people. And I think this question also reminds me of that iceberg, right? Where like you see the violence on the top above the iceberg, that's what you can see, but then underneath there are all these root causes. So I think a lot of the work that CI is doing is addressing those root causes, like inequalities in income, poverty. We're doing a lot of like alternative livelihoods, sustainable agriculture, things to address some of those causes that are relating to the violence. And again, that's just a very simple answer to a very, very complicated question, right?
Indeed. Great. Thank you very much, Janet. I guess I think you gave a lot of light into the question, and we have 30 more minutes to talk about it. So now we will continue with Anupam Anand. He's an evaluation officer at the GEF. He has over 15 years of experience in evaluation, international development, academic research, and teaching. And Anupam has led evaluations on biodiversity, SFM and REDD+, land degradation, fragility and conflict, and illegal wildlife trade. Before GEF, he was a remote sensing scientist at the Global Land Cover Facility, working on multiple NASA-funded projects, including field campaigns for future satellite missions. He holds a PhD on LiDAR remote sensing from the University of Maryland, and a postgraduate diploma in environmental law. So thank you very much, Anupam, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hector, and thank you, Sheila and Janet, for setting up this stage. We have seen in the earlier presentations how conflict and fragility affects the entire project cycle, from implementation to monitoring and evaluation. We are based in the evaluation office of the Global Environment Facility. So I'm just going to focus on monitoring and evaluation challenges in these contexts, and how geospatial science could be useful in monitoring and evaluation of environmental interventions in conflict-affected conservation hotspot. The reason we are talking about conservation and conflict together, because a lot of, as you might remember from Sheila's presentation, that there's a huge overlap of conservation areas with the areas of conflict. And also there's a feedback loop in between the two. Next, please. And this is, we know that monitoring and evaluation is challenging in conflict and fragile situations. And this is where innovative methods such as geospatial science and approaches could be helpful. And the reason they are helpful is because they help us deal with the logistical challenges. We know that it's very difficult for traditional evaluations or monitoring to take place in these contexts. And it's also very expensive to do that. And also there are security concerns. And this is where geospatial methods are very helpful. Also, they help us deal with methodological challenges in general, but also it becomes very important in fragile and conflict situation where we cannot use the traditional evaluation methods. We cannot visit the sites easily. So this is also where these methods are very useful. Geospatial methods also allow analysis at different scales. So we can conduct analysis at a site level, at a country level, or at a regional level. So it really speaks to various scales. And they also aid in objectivity and transparency. This is very important. And since geospatial methods can be replicated and reproduced, therefore, they bring objectivity and transparency in the way we collect data and use information from these contexts. And last but not the least, I would like to mention that these methods are applicable to a variety of monitoring and evaluation methods and themes. And I will demonstrate that in next few slides. I would also like to mention that there has been growing opportunity for using these technology or methods because of the recent development. As we talk today, there are more than 3,400 operational satellites, and these excludes the spy satellites that we do not normally have access to. Also, every day we're getting high resolution data free of cost. And to complement these, there has been rapid advancement in analytical tools. The thing with satellite data is that this is big data, and the more you have it, the less you can do with that. But with cloud computing and other tools readily available to us, it's becoming much more easier to use them. And so these developments have really helped move in this direction. Next slide, please. So what is special about geospatial? So we know that the real world is very complex. And what you're seeing here is a photograph. It's a 2D representation of a real world, but a lot of things are going on. You have vegetation, you have people, you have kids going to school, you have microbes, you have microclimate. I mean, I can just go on and on. But what we do in a geospatial model, we split this into various thematic layers. And these are layers of information that is relevant to the context. So here you have conflict data, you have data from the field visits, socioeconomic surveys, infrastructure, boundaries, physical environment. And what is common amongst all these data layers is that they have spatial information. They have the information of location. So space is the container for all these information. And when we are able to do this, when we are able to build this model, we can ask questions on relevance, on impact, on results, on causes, on trends. So this enables spatial analysis, which helps us understand the distribution, the patterns, and underlying processes. Next slide, please. So here is one example where you see how conflict and conservation overlap. So what you're looking at on your screen is a heat map of protected areas. And these are GEF-supported protected areas since its beginning, overlaid with the conflict data. And you can see that in different regions of the world, there have been conflict-related fatalities within the protected areas that have been supported by GEF. And we know if there are fatalities within the protected areas, it might be very challenging to work there. There are serious implications. So just with a simple example here, we are able to see how conflict and conservation overlap. And the map here on your left shows a Virunga National Park. Not only you are able to see the numbers of conflict, you're also able to see the spatial distribution. Where are these conflicts located? You see more conflict on the southern border. So it makes you more context aware. And with this, you can ask so many questions. And it's also useful, I would say very useful for implementation, for designing the interventions. And we as evaluators, we could ask questions using the evaluation criteria. Next slide, please. Now here's another example. As I mentioned that it's very difficult logistically to work in conflict areas. And what's common between conflict areas and conservation areas is that they both are hard to reach and difficult to gather data in. So here's an example from our evaluation mission in the Pacific region of Colombia. And as you can see, it's mostly intact forest, but also these are the areas of have been historically been area of conflict. And actually I had first-hand experience that we had to actually be evacuated from this area while on the evaluation mission. And that's a story for some other day. But what I want to highlight is that using these methods, we are able to deal with some of the challenges. Next slide, please. So here you have a map of some GEF sites over, and then what you're also looking at the areas of mining and the areas of conflict overlapping each other. And also these are the areas where you have a lot of environmental degradation, deforestation because of the mining. Next slide, please. So I went to one of these illegal sites, and within minutes I was told to leave the place. So I went to a safe distance and I flew a drone. So the drone not only took a picture of or an evidence of the activity, but this was also used to train a machine learning algorithm. So this is the training data for machine learning algorithm that helps us quantify the extent of damage. It's very important to know what is the extent of the problem. From evaluation perspective, we can evaluate whether the project is being targeted in the right areas, whether the proportion of intervention whether the intervention is proportional to the extent of the problem. Next slide, please. So here is the results, or a snapshot of result from that work. And I would also like to mention, and some of you I know are from Colombia, are familiar with this part of Colombia. It's one of the wettest area, as well as one of the most biodiverse regions of the world. But there are satellites which can help us see through the clouds. So radar, they work on microwave principles. So they are actually transparent to the clouds, and using radar and data from the field, we are able to classify and quantify the extent of environmental damage in this region. Next slide, please. Also, as evaluators, we ask question on relevance a lot, whether we are intervening in the right places, whether the intervention is of right scale. And here is an example from the Amazon region, where Jeff has a flagship program. And here you can see that most of the deforestation has happened post-conflict or during the negotiation period. And this project is specifically focused on peace building initiatives. So they're using peace building to address the deforestation challenges. So you can already see that we can use it to ask question on relevance. Next slide, please. Now, one of the key questions that evaluators ask is about impact. What happens when the intervention takes place, or what would have happened if there was no intervention? And here is an example from a watershed project, which had a main component to deal with soil erosion and also increasing the extent of the lake area with dredging and other techniques. So this is post-conflict Rwanda, but COVID had just set in, so we couldn't go there. But we wanted to know what happened there. So this is where you have an evidence of increase in the water body or the area of the lake. And this is an empirical evidence. Now, how did this happen? Why did this happen? And those kind of questions need boots on the ground. You need to go and interview people and figure out how did that happen. But we have quantitative evidence of how much the lake area changed, where did it change, where it didn't change. And this is all possible through the use of remote sensing. Also, in terms of sustainability, we can ask question on sustainability. What happened after the project closure? And here you can see that the project area is intact, and rest of the areas which are not part of the project, outside protected area, and even in the country, things are not normal. They have been witnessing unprecedented forest loss. And next slide, please. So this is the last example, and this is during COVID. So what we did, we used nighttime light data to look at the economic activities in Africa. We know that a lot of Africa's economy is based on wildlife tourism or nature-based tourism. And one way to look at is to look at the activities within the protected areas. And we saw that out of around 9,000 odd protected areas, 75% of the protected areas saw a decrease in light intensity. That means the there were less activities in all those tourist camps and safari camps out there, including Serengeti, Masai Mara, you name it. And where you don't see the decrease, they didn't have much tourist activities anyway. I mean, protected areas in Sierra Leone and some countries of Central Africa due to the conflict. This was validated through cell phone mobility data. So if you visit somewhere, your location is tracked, and Google freely made this data available for COVID-based research. So we leveraged that to validate this finding. And
Anupam, sorry, you have 1 minute
I'm almost done.
left.
This is the next slide is my last slide.
Sorry to interrupt you. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, we can talk about it during the question session. Next slide, please. Yeah, so there are some resources on how we use it, what the challenges on our website. So if you're interested to know more, you can go and check out these key documents. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and thanks to the interpreters, and thanks for flipping through the slides.
Thank you very much, Anupam. It was really, really interesting. I really liked these approaches of qualifying the extent of the environmental damage, and how these, I'm curious to know more, maybe in the last 30 minutes, how this could be translated into ecosystem restoration, etc. But right now I would like to ask you if you can share very quickly some practical considerations for leveraging geospatial science for monitoring and evaluation.
Yeah, thank you, Hector. That's a great question. And I had actually a slide on that, but I know this question is coming, so I skipped the slide. So there are a few practical considerations that we have learned through our work, integrating remote sensing methods with other traditional evaluation methods. The first is questions first. So it always has, you need to work on the question, and once you have the right set of questions, then you want to see what are the methods that could be useful to answer those. And that's when you decide whether to use remote sensing or not, whether to use geospatial or not. That's one. Second is budget and timelines. So you really need to be familiar with the budgets and timelines, because some analysis could take longer time, could also be very expensive, so beyond the scope of your evaluation budget. So that's also very important. Also, for these kind of methods, partnership is very important. You don't want to reinvent the wheel. Also, most of the evaluation offices do not have these kind of skills or even the tools to enable these kind of analysis. So it's very important that we partner with people who have been doing this for long. So we have partnered with NASA, we have partnered with several universities, and of course, a lot of interns. And I also would like to highlight that these kind of innovative methods, they're very dynamic. And as part of evaluation, we have to keep ourselves updated, because every day there would be a new satellite, there would be a new method, there would be a new tool. And as evaluators, it's very important to keep ourselves updated and be part of a dynamic learning process. Also, triangulation, because one method, no matter what method it is, cannot be a silver bullet. And geospatial is not only, I would say, the game in the town. So you have to bring in all the methods to make sure that you have a robust evidence base. That should be the focus. And finally, I would like to mention, and this is very important for FCS context, that we need to be very ethical in collecting data, so data privacy concern. And also, we need to make sure that these kind of data, remote sensing satellites, nowadays you have millimeter resolution data. So you can read someone's like time on someone's wrist watch from space. So you have to make sure that you do not bring any harm. You do not make people vulnerable using these technology. And this is very, very important in a conflict and fragile situation. With that, I'll just stop.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Anupam. Okay, now we're leaving the floor to Shadi Amatnia. She's an environmental specialist and consultant at the World Bank's Environment, Natural Resources and Blue Economy Global Practice. She's working on supporting conflict sensitivity in the World Bank operations for environment and climate change related projects in fragile and conflict affected settings. Prior to this effort, she was involved in building the capacity of countries and strengthening platforms for indigenous and community voices in Latin America and the Caribbean to advance equitable, effective reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, REDD+, and implement projects that conserve and restore critical landscapes. So thank you very much, Shadi, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hector, for that introduction. And I have to say, it's such an honor to be on this panel and with these colleagues whose work I've admired for a long time. Is the PowerPoint, I'm waiting for the PowerPoint to be up. Oh, thank you. So today I'm going to be talking about building civil society capacity for success and the lessons that we've gotten at the World Bank from our work in conservation and engaging stakeholders. Next, please. So to start off with, I want to say that the World Bank has been really changing its approach to working in fragile and conflict-affected situations. In 2020, the World Bank released its strategy for fragility, conflict, and violence. And its objectives are to enhance the World Bank Group's effectiveness to support countries in addressing the drivers and impacts of FCV and strengthening their resilience, especially for the most vulnerable and marginalized populations. And to do so, it articulates 4 different pillars of engagement: preventing violent escalation into conflict, remaining engaged during conflicts and crisis situations to protect human capital and institutions, helping countries transition out of fragility, and finally, mitigating the spillover and impacts of FCV, such as climate change and migration. Next. And so what does this mandate mean for the bank and how it operates? The focus on prevention is new for the bank, and it marks an institutional shift to go beyond do no harm to really helping with the peace building process. And this is a valuable entry point for environmental and natural resource projects to capitalize upon. Throughout the document, there's explicit recognition of the importance of natural resources and climate-related drivers of fragility and conflict, as well as the impacts of fragility and conflict on the environment. And it also marks an increasing reliance on assessments and diagnostics to inform country engagements and consequently lending. And that's why it's so key to look at the human and environment, the human vulnerability and environment nexus, because as the final bullet point says, because the strategy rightly so pays particular attention to disadvantaged and vulnerable groups. Next, please. Because civil societies, local communities, and indigenous peoples are key stakeholders for sustainable, stable conservation outcomes. Even if a country isn't on the World Bank's fragile and conflict-affected situations list, communities around areas of conservation living within or on the periphery of protected areas are often highly resource dependent and vulnerable as a result of its continued degradation and resource pressures on it. They typically have strained state-society relations and face exclusion. In other words, they're very vulnerable. Next, please. And so an assessment of the World Bank's projects by the independent evaluation group found the programs that have yielded the largest benefits, both environmentally and socially, were those where threatened areas and vulnerable resource users were carefully targeted. Could you click, please? So the independent evaluation group's assessment found that overall, the World Bank has been effective at improving natural resource management practices, and environmental outcomes and measuring them. And as Anupam just showed us, a lot of this has to do with remote sensing. But going forward, next, could you click, please? There's a need to focus on the social impacts of that interventions have on the resource dependent. To think upfront and throughout the project cycle, who are the users, what are their needs, and what can we do to mitigate the harms? Because it's very hard to prevent what you don't plan for or protect, or to protect who you haven't recognized yet. For example, in fragile and conflict settings, even the most degraded land has value as a social safety net for users. For example, for passing through with livestock, grazing, or wood to gather by women for their livelihoods. Next slide. Could you go back, please? So increasing the value of degraded lands by planting trees or setting up payment for ecosystem service payments, for example, increases the value of the land and makes it subject to increased predation, encroachment, displacing the local population, and thus exacerbating the vulnerability of the vulnerable. Next slide, please. And so evidence of impacts on land and communities need to be studied, and it's imperative to engage these communities in a way that's constructive and beneficial to their livelihoods, so that they have options and economic opportunities to improve not only conflict outcomes, but also conservation outcomes. And we need their full and effective participation and respect for their traditional knowledge and rights, as other speakers have rightly mentioned, to provide culturally and economically appropriate solutions. And part of making sure that happens is by giving resource-dependent communities a voice and a platform. And that's why I'd like to talk about our experience with REDD+. Next slide. Because social consultation has been a part of its very fiber from the beginning. And these lessons can be applied to conservation more widely. For those that aren't familiar, REDD+ stands for Reducing Emissions in Deforestation and Degradation, and it's a results-based payment program to conserve forest assets and landscapes. And around half of all REDD+ programs are in countries that have been fragile and conflict states. And a commonality across all REDD+ projects is civil society engagement. The REDD+ methodology emphasizes that without local community and indigenous engagement, forest stands and co-benefits from biodiversity to watershed health will not be achieved. And I wanted to share some of the World Bank's experiences, next slide, from particularly the regional capacity building program. The World Bank gave intermediary, regional, indigenous, and civil society organizations support to facilitate capacity building and knowledge sharing sub-projects to local organizations that otherwise the bank would never be able to fund because it has very strict funding restrictions. And as you can see in this figure, I've included it because you can see how the capacity building was quite holistic. From the bottom, in terms of strengthening the organizational capacity of the organization, and then providing knowledge exchange and trainings to build awareness and ownership in building the knowledge base of traditional knowledge and the intersection of REDD+, and creating entry points with governments and REDD+ decision makers. Next slide. And so even though the World Bank has a few incentives to support small investment operations because of the high transactional costs, this was seen as a no regrets investment for the bank because it was an investment that's useful outside of the context of REDD+ and synergistic with the bank's wider objectives. Because when you maintain and respect institutional channels, you get ownership, legitimacy, and sustainability. And by building their capacity, you're making these organizations attractive to other donors as well. And it's important to note that civil society organizations and indigenous organizations have been working in the advocacy space for a long time, and they still face structural barriers to inclusion. But what we can do is provide support to help them unify their agenda and advocate at the national, regional, and global levels. and also encourage inclusion and equity within those traditional structures to include who has been traditionally marginalized, women, Afro-descendants, youth, etc., and give visibility to their contributions. Next slide. Next slide, thank you. Finally, we learned we needed to consider the livelihoods and realities in the design of consultations. We need to recognize the time constraints because in reality, the people in local communities have limited availability to learn about environmental protection issues. Daily life competes for their time and can prevent their extensive participation. And on that point, given the limited time availability, we need to lead with the economic message because projects need to make the connection between conservation with livelihoods and food security very clear. In the case of the RED Plus capacity building program, participation in trainings on environmental protection issues, they'd host them and no one would come. But it was only when they were paired with livelihood activities like beekeeping and like best practices in seed management that people would come and see it as a way to enhance their traditional and alternative livelihoods. And finally, we can seize opportunities by engaging with groups on their own terms. In Latin America, for example, organizations noted that all Indigenous peoples attended workshops and trainings with their families. And what an opportunity this is to have really intergenerational engagement with youth and provide didactic materials catered to them. And at the same time, again, we need to consider who has been excluded from traditional consultation mechanisms. They may require a dedicated approach separately and are likely to not speak in front of the very community marginalizing them. Next slide. And on that, I'd like to end my presentation by zooming back out and really emphasizing that we need to look at the impacts on land and communities from the programmatic level, as Tracy so rightfully said in the comments. We need to look beforehand on these dynamics and at the project level as well and continue monitoring them. At the bank, for example, we have our risk and resilience assessments that form like the basic of our country engagement decisions and eventually lending. And even though they mention degradation, they fail to make the connection to human vulnerability. And so if we want to have successful, sustainable, equitable conservation outcomes that will improve lives, we need to have these considerations not at the beginning of the project, but throughout the project cycle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shadi, for the interesting presentation. I really liked that you mentioned, you just hear the alarm clock. You were perfect in timing. But I really like that you mentioned to recognize these local realities that sometimes could be really different, and also the time availability of the farmers that really resonate with me, and how you can integrate conservation activities in their daily lives, right, in their quotidianity. And I would like to ask you if you can mention or go a little bit further into the challenges of building capacity in communities that have been highly affected by armed conflict. So like victims of violence, people that had trauma, etc. Yeah, I would like you, if you can tell us a little bit about it.
Sure, of course. So as Sheila described in her presentation, how GEF projects are impacted, a lot of our World Bank projects that are in fragile and conflict states are funded by GEF, are funded by grants. Because, you know, one complication that we get is that if you don't have the traditional funding streams at the World Bank, if there's a transition in power, sometimes the funding isn't there. The funding envelope is no longer there. And so this funding from GEF, funding from RED Plus really gives us the environment global practice in particular, an opportunity to step into these spaces and really provide development support. Because let's look at what happens during conflict, right? You have rapid social, economic, and environmental changes. And it's an economic shock to livelihoods. But the thing is, there are hotspots that are often, that can be in cities and are sometimes in rural areas, but are often the thing that we see, and we see it in Colombia, we see it in other countries as well. You'll have hotspots, and then you'll also have simmering spots. And even though it might be difficult for us to work in hotspots specifically, which we're trying to learn, as you can see with the FCV mandate, that is what we want best practices in. But in those simmering spots, we can play a key role in building the resilience of those communities, in making sure that those communities are able to maintain their livelihoods, maintain their food security, and not fall into even more risk of instability.
All right, thank you very much for your answer. I've seen that the discussion was very active in the chat, and I've seen that there are some questions that were already responded in the chat and the conversation, but others that not. So I will start with a question of Daphne Jean, which goes to Sheila. So she says that beyond conducting this terminal evaluation for GEF, is there tracking to see how much of the conservation outcomes in conflict-prone areas have been sustained over time, including after the project life?
Yeah, that's a great question, Daphne. And I'll also invite Anupam to weigh in on this one, just because working with the GEF Independent Evaluation Office, he has a better landscape view, I think, of how the sustainability tracking processes go. But on our end, a lot of this, at least at the time the evaluation was conducted, I think that things are kind of in flux and changing now. But at the time, there wasn't kind of a dedicated effort to tracking the sustainability in fragile or conflict-affected situations, but rather, each project and each kind of tranche of funding has its own mechanism for monitoring sustainability. So, for example, in a lot of the project documents we reviewed, there's a sustainability report attached that was updated over certain amounts of times, different intervals for different projects. But I don't know if the GEF has begun tracking that information at this point. And Anupam, if you'd like to weigh in on how you're adapting to that.
All right. Great. So now I'm going to go with a question from Julio Gorricho to Janet, and this is something that I'm also very interested in to hearing, and is she says that thanks for sharing the CI experience, and this point about conflict sensitivity being not the same to environmental peace building. If you could give some examples on this based on your experience.
So just to clarify, I actually think they're the same thing, but there's a couple comments later, especially Amanda did a shameless plug, as she called it, for one of her parts of the compendium with Sheila, where they seem to say that they're different. So perhaps this is another session at a future conference, right? Like where are we splitting all these things into, whatever. Just to say from my perspective, like environmental peace building is the big overarching umbrella. And I noticed in the white paper, the kind of definition had expanded since the last time I saw it. So I do think we are like bringing in different parts of the environmental world into this conversation, and the developing international development world as well. So to me, they are the same. Conflict sensitivity, conflict sensitive conservation might be like one of the pillars holding up the tent, perhaps. Maybe we think of it that way. But like the work that CI is doing, where we're really trying to test the approaches for conflict sensitive conservation. We just had a pilot in one of our countries where they did like a conflict analysis, a bunch of community consultations. They went and looked at an area around a rather rigidly defined protected area, and ended up coming up with tons of new information that they didn't know about, concerns, tensions, causes, and then they were able to have a dialogue and reach out to a new partner to start doing some work that would be a little bit more integrated, and looking at, livelihood concerns and sharing of resources and stuff like that. Then so that was in one country we work with. In another one, like in Kenya, where we're supporting Northern Rangelands Trust, and a woman I think you all know, Josephine Kuru. She has women peace builders, and we were training them and trying them to get them to look at drivers of conflict, which they're already doing, but then looking at new approaches that they could be using. So to me, all of that is conflict sensitivity, and it's all under this larger environmental peace building umbrella. But I would love to see that debate, because I know there's a lot of people in this chat room right now that would love to get in there. So maybe that's a note for Carl for the future.
Yeah, great, Janet. I resonate really with this idea. For me, I also have used the do no harm and conflict sensitivity approach as an entry point to get into attributions of the projects into peace building, like environmental projects into peace building. And that is based on this idea of finding the dividers, some things that could cause conflict, but also the connectors. So diminishing the dividers and enhancing the connectors would improve the activities and have like a more do good and more active peace building. But yeah, super interesting. And also, now that you mentioned about these partnerships as a way to address conflict sensitivity, Julia also asked to Sheila with regards on partnering with local stakeholders in order to carry on conservation in conflict affected contexts. What would you consider would be the key aspects of these partnerships?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, the first thing I would emphasize with that is that there's not really a one size fits all. I think that the way you approach different communities should be different based on those communities and their needs. I really liked what, Shadi said about emphasizing, the community's purposes first in trying to approach, as you mentioned, if you're advertising something like environmental peace or environmental protection training, it's not as helpful as something that appeals directly to their needs in that community, something like the seed management aspect of it, right? I think that essentially the approach really should be to start by just putting out a feeler and just trying to sense what the community needs. And that really starts from, doing the front work, trying to figure out who in the community is a key person to speak to, how you can get a feel for those types of things. And I think that actually speaks a lot to kind of monitoring and evaluation practices, also just figuring out where these points in the systems are that you can be plugging into for information. And I think in Julia's question, there's also an aspect of, how can these partnerships influence the conservation side of things? I actually think that goes a lot to something we didn't get to talk about as much during this session. I think it came up in some other of the presentations, but the importance of the adaptive management aspect of things, and being willing to move your plans around based on what you're hearing during implementation with the communities, and trying to adapt your methods to put their purposes first and to find kind of common ground areas to achieve your objectives in a way that meets their goals as well. So in summary, basically, I think it's complicated in that, you meet people where they are at and you adjust course as needed. And I think that that's the best answer I can give on that.
Great indeed. It's a call of attention also to donors to have allow for this flexibility in programs to adapt to these contingencies that are happening all the time. Yeah, for sure. So we have a couple of more questions in the chat. Marisa Ensor, she said to any of the panelists that most of you have discussed issues surrounding conflict sensitivity conservation. In her own work in progress in this field focuses on the conservation conflict peace nexus. From the flip side, peace building through conservation. The mobilized adult and child soldiers being trained in conservation, wildlife ambassadors, as a strategy to discourage them from re-enlisting. Is any of the panelists or audience members also working on this topic? Any advice, suggestions, references? So I'm going to take notice of this because there was just this experience with WWF Colombia where It was conducted biological expeditions with former combatants in a hotspot biodiversity area that was not previously open for civil society due to conflict. And with the support from WWF, there was a biological expedition that was conducted in tandem with ex-rebels and scientists to do a biological inventory and also try to enter into this unexplored area to in the future make ecotourism, which is resonated a lot with the former combatants, and also provide them livelihoods, etc. They also have some preventions on it, so it's interesting. But I will open the floor to the panelists if you want to address this. Janet, Sheila, Shadi?
Just from the Conservation International perspective, I'm not aware of work that we're doing precisely like that. I think Josephine's work that I mentioned in Northern Rangelands Trust, where they are trying to really use techniques of early warning and training and active education to prevent violence, which does happen within those communities and the conservancies in that area. That's somewhat what I think Marissa is talking about, and maybe not exactly the same thing. But I also take in that, the whole thing about rangers and having a much more careful look at how we're using, patrolling and things like that in our conservation, and how we do need to maybe be very careful about that, and looking more on the prevention side, right, with education and that kind of thing.
I think I can also jump in here a little bit. So if you remember the graphic I put up during my presentation regarding kind of the risk management strategies, one of those categories is peace building, right? So organizations that have entered these spaces and not only tried to avoid conflict, or not only tried to prevent their outcomes from being impacted, but have tried to actively build peace between conflicting groups. And I think that, one of the things that's very interesting with environmental peace building is you have both ends, people coming in from the conservation side of things and ending up doing a lot with the peace building side, and people coming in from the peace building side and realizing that natural resource management can be a tool in that respect. So while I can't think of anything to kind of perfectly address or give you an example off the top of my head, certainly we saw a lot of work with the GEF projects, particularly I would say in transboundary water work was one standout area where we saw a lot of that happening, where a lot of that has been happening. If you take a look at the chat link, there's a little bit more specificity in the chapter with that graphic, and then also Marissa, I can follow up with you on email and pull out a couple of examples that might be helpful.
Great. Okay, thank you. I think there is to finish up, we have just 1 minute, but there is a really interesting question from Andres Home, and he says that many of the experience are focusing on risk management, but he wants to know if any of the panelists could elaborate on the other directions, meaning how the project could affect the fragile settings and have maybe unintended consequences, exacerbating pre-existing conflicts or sparking new ones.
Sure, I could speak to that. I think it's important for us to keep in mind no intervention is neutral, and to keep in mind what are the positives, who are the winners, who are the losers. And across our work, I'm sure CI has examples, I'm sure Jeff has examples, and the World Bank certainly has examples where, when you change the value of natural resources, as I mentioned, whether they're becoming degraded and people are losing out because of that, or if they're becoming more valuable and people are getting, if you have traditional protected areas, you had people get kicked out. If, as I mentioned in my presentation, if you're increasing the value of degraded land that only the poor and the marginalized use, guess who else is going to also be interested in using that land? the more powerful. And so that's why it's really important for us to pay attention and really think through with a sense of humility what our projects in the pipeline are doing and what are projects that are already underway, and be vigilant about those potential negative impacts.
Indeed. Okay, thanks. Thank you very much. I think we cover a lot of issues on the subject and a lot of light into it. I think we draw also, or especially the panelists. I really appreciate the participation from all the audience and all the panelists with the outstanding presentations. And have a great time in the rest of the conference. Okay.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Maria, you can go ahead and end the meeting.